Okay, welcome everyone. In this video, I'm going to show you how you can use your own AWS S3 bucket to store the files for your Bubble application without using any plugins or third-party solutions. So there's a couple reasons you might want to do this. You can keep your costs down if you have a data-intensive application, and you might need more control than normal over your data. Maybe you're in the healthcare space, or you have privacy restrictions or something you have to obey, and so you might want to control your data a bit more. In this tutorial, we'll set up a direct connection between your Bubble app and your S3 bucket. And there are several different ways you could do this, and I'll talk a bit about some alternatives, but I'm going to show you what I think is the simplest way to do it. So I'll quickly show you what this looks like in action, and then I'll talk about the outline of what this demo will be, and then we'll build it from the base up. So we've got these two images here of cats, this upload button, and we've got this bucket on S3 called upload test bucket 123. And we're going to upload, so these are those two pictures we just saw, cat 1 and cat 3. I'll explain this 123 dash file name stuff in a bit. But we've got these two images, and so what we can do here is pick, say, cat 2, and we'll click upload, and it says file cat 2 was uploaded, and we can see it pops up here. And if we come back to our bucket and reload it, now we can see cat 2. If we sort these by modified, you'll see cat 2 is just uploaded. So that's basically it. We can upload files to a bucket, and then we can pull them back down into our Bubble app later when we need them. So I'll talk quickly about how we're going to do this at an architectural level, and then we'll get into building it. Okay, so now I'll just spend a minute talking about how we're going to do this and how we're not going to do it, and then we'll start to build. So a very common pattern you'll see if you look for tutorials and guides is to connect a Lambda and API gateway to some backend AWS service like S3. I've covered doing this in a few different tutorials before, and this is an excellent pattern for all kinds of use cases. We're not going to do that in this case, though. What we're going to do basically is get rid of the Lambda function and have something that looks like this. So our Bubble application will talk to an API gateway that talks directly to AWS S3. And this is by doing something called a service integration, which I'll show you in just a minute. But it simplifies the architecture a little bit. You don't have to worry about this Lambda function. You don't have to write any code here. You're basically just hooking into the S3 API using this API gateway integration. So if that all seems very abstract, then hopefully it will become clear as we go. But I think that this is the simplest method to do this, and you can get it set up in just a few minutes. So let's start doing that now. Okay, so here's a quick overview of the steps that we need to follow to get this working. So first we need to have a Bubble application created. Then we need to create an S3 bucket in AWS. Then we need to create an AWS role that will allow us access to that bucket to upload and download files from it. Then we're going to create an API gateway with a couple of methods that allow us to talk to that bucket using this role. Then we're going to test that the API is working with a tool called Insomnia. So Insomnia and Postman are two common tools just for testing APIs outside the browser and outside of code. It makes things a bit easier in development. And then we're going to build the front end to allow us to upload the files from Bubble. So that, if we bring that back, is that's this stuff here. So the upload button, we need to write a bit of HTML and JavaScript to handle uploading these files and sending it off to this API endpoint. If you've never done front-end development, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, this should be a fairly gentle introduction to how you can do some of it, and as well as an introduction to how you can integrate some custom front-end development code into your Bubble applications. And then the last thing we'll do is build the API and backend to allow us to pull these files down. And so what that amounts to is creating a GET endpoint in the API gateway and connecting Bubble's API connector to that GET endpoint. So we'll have a post endpoint to upload the files and a GET endpoint to pull them down. And so that's it. So let's get started, and it shouldn't take too long. Okay, so step 0, as I mentioned, is to have a Bubble application that you've created. So I've got an empty Bubble app here, and I'm going to install a couple of plugins. One is API connector, because we're going to need, later on, we're going to use API connector to pull the images down. We're not going to be using it to upload the images. We're going to be using a JavaScript function to do that we write, but we need it to pull the images down. You could do it without, but it's easier to do it with. Okay, and then we need the JavaScript Toolbox plugin. Both of these are free, and the Toolbox plugin allows us to write custom JavaScript in our apps. So these two together are very handy. And yeah, now that we've got those installed, that's all we need to do to get the Bubble app set up. We'll come back later and create a data type to hold, I guess we're here, let's just do it now. Let's say uploaded file, and we'll create one field called name for the file, and just be text. And this name is how we'll know where to grab the file later. So very, very simple data structure right now. And that's it for there. So if we come back to S3 on AWS, we'll create a bucket, and let's call it bubble upload demo. Let's do this, bubble upload demo. And we'll put it in US East 1. It doesn't matter, as long as you connect your API gateway and your bucket to the same region, you should be fine. We'll leave all this default, and I don't think we need to change anything. So we'll create our bucket, and now we have a place to stick our objects. Okay, so now that we have our bucket, the next step is to create a role to allow us to interact with it, to upload and download objects inside it. So if you're new to AWS, a role is kind of like a virtual user. So anytime you interact with an AWS service like API Gateway or S3 or Lambda, you typically do it using a role, and that role has permissions attached to it, and those permissions are defined as policies or policy statements. So what we're going to do is create a role and attach a policy statement to it that only allows us access to this bucket. So to do that, you go to the IAM console. Incidentally, IAM stands for Identity and Access Management. And then what you want to do is click Create Role. So we're going to create a role, and we're going to pick this. In the first step, you pick a trusted entity. And so we're going to pick API Gateway, because that's the entity that we want this role to interact with. We click this, and all this trusted entity role or type allows us to do is push logs to CloudWatch. So it doesn't give us access to S3. It just sets up this logging functionality. We'll come back into this role in a second and add the S3 permissions. So we click Next, and we can click Next through this again. Then we want to give it a role, so let's call it our bubble uploader role. And we can click Create Role down here. Incidentally, this is an example of a policy statement. We're going to be attaching another one in just a second. So click Create Role. You see it loads for a second. Then it'll bring us back to our main screen. And now we can see our new role right here, bubble uploader role. So we'll click on this. And what we're going to do is click Add Permissions. So there's two different ways you can add permissions. You can attach a policy which AWS manages. So there's a bunch of predefined policy statements in here, or you can create an inline policy. So the quickest way to do this is to say attach policies, type S3, and say I want full access to all of my assets on AWS S3. You click Attach Policies, and it'll update your role. And now you can see down here, you have access to everything in S3 with this role. But if you want to have more fine-grained control, maybe you have 10 different buckets in your account and you only want this API that we're creating to be able to interact with a single bucket, you don't want to do that. So you remove that. If you want more fine-grained control, what you do is you say add or create inline policy. So we create this, and what we do here is we have to specify the service we want, the actions we want to allow in that service, and then the resources we want to give access to. So the service we want is S3. So we click this, find S3. Whoops. Click S3 and it should load it. Don't want this documentation open. And then what you can do is you can say all S3 actions, or you can specify blocks of actions. And so the access level we want is we want to be able to write files and we want to be able to read files. If I click list, it'll check all these boxes here. I don't need this, so I'm not going to add the list. And I don't need, if you expand, say read, you can see there's a whole bunch of different functions in here. We don't need them all. All we need are get object and put object. So this is get object, we want this one. And then for write, we want put object, which is right here. And you can hover over these tooltips to see, or click on these tooltips to see what it allows you to do. So we want permission to add an object to a bucket. That's what we want to do. Incidentally, when we get to the next step, which is setting up the API, I'm not going to be following this document, but basically this document from AWS explains the process that we're going to be going through. And so, for example, it says here you want the put object permission in your IAM role. That's what we're doing right now. That's sort of the precursor before you create your API. So if we come back here, back here, we want the get object and the put object permissions for the actions that we're going to allow. And then the resources we want to allow We could say all resources in our account, but again, the reason we didn't use that S3 full access AWS managed policy is to avoid this. So to add our bucket, to specify what resource we want access to, you can come in here and type your bucket name and object name. So we know, so bubble upload demo is the name of our bucket. So we can just type it in here and then type star for any object name. So we want to upload a file with any name or download a file with any name. That's a fine way to do it. Or you can come over to your S3 bucket and go to the Properties tab, and you'll see the Amazon resource name here. And so this just gets auto-populated if you type the bucket name in here. So let's do this. You need a slash on the end, I think, for it to auto-complete. So we do this, click Add. And so now this policy that we're creating will be scoped to that bucket only. Then click Review Policy. We want to give it a name, so let's say Bubble Upload Policy. A lot of typos here, and then click Create Policy. And so that's all we have to do to create our role in our policy, and then we're going to attach this role to our API integration in a minute. We're going to need this ARN here, so we'll keep this window open for a minute, and then when we come over to API Gateway, it's going to ask us for this ARN, to say when we invoke this API, what role do we want to use to invoke it. Okay, so now that we've got our role created and our permissions set up, the next thing to do is to actually create our API. So you can come over to API Gateway. You can either type it in here. If you type API, it should be your first response, or you can come into Services, and under Networking and Content Delivery down here, you can click that. When we come in, we'll see this screen here prompting us to choose an API type. If you've already got APIs built before in here, you'll see something a bit different. But what we want to do is create a REST API. So we click Build down here, and then it'll bring us to this wizard. So it shows a welcome message. You can just click OK. We want to keep this as REST. And then you've got this example API with a bunch of information you can use. We don't need this, so we're going to click New API to build a new one. And we'll say Bubble Uploader API, Bubble Upload API. Leave a description blank or put something here if you want, and then end type we'll leave as regional. So click Create API, and then you're brought to the tool bench or the workspace to create your API. So what we're going to want to do is create an API that looks like, if I open a new tab, looks like base URL / bucket name / file name. I don't know if you're able to see this. It's a bit small, but so what we're going to do is we're going to create under our root resource, which is right here, we're going to create two sub-resources. First a bucket name resource and then a file name resource. Actually, we're just going to call this bucket. And so what we want to do first is create our bucket resource. So we click Create Resource and type bucket. And then we want to put the same thing in curly braces. So that tells you here that you can add path parameters. So this will be treated as a variable in the next step, where we say replace whatever's in this component of the path with some variable name, which will be the name of our bucket bubble upload demo. This will make it a bit more flexible so that you can upload to different buckets. You could hard code this, but for the sake of flexibility and instruction, we'll make it a parameter. It's also the way that they do it in this tutorial here. They use slightly different terms, but it's the same structure. So back here, so we want to make sure to enable gateway cores. If you don't do this, you can enable it manually later. I'll show you how to do that just in case. But you need to have cores enabled. Cores stands for cross-origin resource sharing, and this allows web pages to load resources from other web pages. Your browser will by default block a request from a web page that goes to a different URL unless you explicitly say in the request response that you want to allow that. It's just a security measure, so this trips up a lot of people. I've spent a lot of time trying to debug cores issues. They're kind of nightmarish sometimes. So just make sure you check this box and click Create Resource. And so after you create it, you'll see this. You'll see you have this options method. This is what handles that cores request that I just mentioned. But there's no post or get methods or anything in here, so you don't directly interact with this endpoint. What you do is add another sub-resource. And this one's going to be called file name. We do the same thing. We make it a path parameter by putting in brackets and enabling cores. And click Create Resource again. And so now what we're going to have is our base URL / bucket / file name. And now what we want to do is actually create the method that we're going to, or the endpoint that we're going to call. So what we're going to do is click Create Method. And for this, we're going to use a post request. I think you can do this with a put request as well. It's often considered standard to use a put request to upload files, but post works fine in most cases as well. So we're going to say post and click the check mark. And then it brings us to this method setup screen. And so in some previous tutorials, we've done some Lambda function integrations. Like I said at the beginning of this tutorial, that's probably the most common way of using API gateways with Lambda function integrations. But what we're going to do instead is this AWS service integration. So here is how we specify the behavior of what should happen when you call API gateway at this endpoint. So the region you want could be anything. I'm just going to pick US East 1 because that's what I'm working in right now. The service we want is the simple storage service, also known as S3. You can leave subdomain blank. The method that we're going to use here, this is a little bit confusing. So the HTTP method is what we're going to be calling against the S3 API. So we're going to call the put object method. And so we're going to use the put HTTP method to talk to that. You can experiment with this. A post might work as well, but I'm going to use put. And notice that this post and put are different. This is sort of what happens after you call the API. So this is in the background. This is the integration between API gateway and the backend service S3. This is not your API gateway endpoint that you're configuring. For our action type, we're going to use a path override, and that's going to specify how to call the S3 API. So what we want to do is say bucket/key. So bucket/key. And so that's going to take these two parameters and replace it. We're calling it key here because in S3 parlance, file name is a key. And so the file name that we pass in our URL is going to be the key for the file name. And then for our execution role, we're going to put the ARN of that role that we created over here in IAM. So we copy this and we paste it in here. And now when we invoke this API endpoint, it's going to use this execution role. So that's good. And so then we can leave content handling as pass-through. So we're going to be passing a binary file to this API endpoint, and we just want it to pass it to S3 as a binary file. We don't want it to convert it to anything. If you were passing base64 data or text or something, you might change these, but we're going to be using images, so we'll keep it as pass-through. And then for the default timeout, it's 29,000 milliseconds or 29 seconds. You can change this if you want. I'm just going to leave it as default. And then click save, and then you'll be brought back to this screen. And now this shows you sort of the path that your API takes. So this client is going to be our bubble app. In this test environment, this is just like it's like a testing bench. So if you click test, you can add some dummy data in here and test that it works. We're not going to do that here. We're going to test with Insomnia in a minute. But what happens is you pass from the client, you pass the API request to this method request, which is our post method that we built here. That's going to pass to an integration request, which we're going to change in just 1 second. That's going to go to S3, and then there's going to be an integration response, and then a method response, and then back to the client. So it follows this sort of path here. So it's a bit overwhelming if you've never seen this. There's a lot of things happening behind the scenes, but that's kind of the power of API Gateway, is it sort of abstracts away all of this stuff so that most of the time it just works. So the only other thing that we need to do is come into integration request, and this is all the stuff that we set up in the last step. Now what we need to do is specify what we want to do with those path parameters that we set here. So we're going to add 2 parameters. The first one will be our bucket, and then we'll pull out the value for the bucket. It shows you an example of the format of how to get the parameter here. So what we want is method.request.path.bucket. That's this first one. And then the second one is going to be our file name. It's going to be key, and it's going to be pulled from method.request.path.filename. So you might be able to call this sub-resource key and then make key map to key. I haven't tried that, but feel free to experiment and see if it makes it a bit cleaner in your head to keep track of things. So that's all we have to do. So now the bucket component of our path gets mapped to the bucket parameter in the path override, and the file name component of our path gets mapped to the key parameter. And so now our API is almost ready to go. There's one other thing, which is to come into settings and specify that we want to use binary media types. And so this has implications for how various backend services handle incoming files. In our case, what we want to do is pass a binary file from the client, which is from our Bubble app, straight into S3 without modifying it at all. And so we wanted to treat it as a binary media type and not have API Gateway do anything with it. And so you'll often see in tutorials people type this, */*, and that means treat any request coming into this API as a binary file. And this works in some cases, but this can really trip you up. It's not going to work in our case because of that CORS header that I mentioned. So in those options methods, you need to have JSON coming in. I'm not going to go too far into what CORS does, but basically you have, when you make a request that's CORS enabled, you have to make two requests, an options request and then whatever your method is, like post in our case. And if you type this here, then it will mess up your initial options request to handle CORS. I've spent a long time getting stuck on this, so that's why I'm sort of beating it a little bit to death. What you want to do instead is type the type of file that you expect to handle by your API. So in our case, we're going to be using JPEGs and PNG files, but you might be handling, say, PDFs or documents, or maybe you're doing something else, some other kind of file like video or audio. These are what are called MIME types. So if you are trying to figure out how to use, say, audio uploads and you want to figure out what to type here, you can say audio MIME types, and that should give you, for example, XWave, or there's some other ones here. So there's all kinds of references here that you can figure out what to use. So this kind of stuff here. Okay, so back into this, what we want is these two here. We could also do this, by the way. We could say image /*. So any image coming in, that's probably a bit cleaner. If people are uploading different kinds of images, that might be a better way to do it. But yeah, we're going to click Save Changes, and now our API should be ready to go. And so now the last thing to do, now that we've got everything set up, is to actually deploy our API. So you come to the Resources tab, and you click Actions, and click Deploy API. And this will actually make the API live. And you need to have a stage to deploy to, and by default you don't have one, so you click New Stage. You can call it Dev or whatever you like, Test, and click Deploy. And now it'll bring you to your stages overview. And so now we have this URL that we can use to invoke our API. So what we should be able to do now is plug this into Insomnia or Postman or something else, and then upload a file to our bucket, and then just test that the integration between API Gateway and S3 is working. And then after that, we'll move on to writing our front-end code in Bubble to let us do it from there, which is a little bit more complicated. So let's try this in Insomnia first and see if it's working. Okay, so we're going to use Insomnia, which is this program here on the left. Here's the homepage for it, insomnia.rest. So this is a fantastic tool. It's free, open source, available on all the platforms, and it just allows you to build your APIs and test them, make sure everything's working. If you ever heard of Postman before, it's the same idea. It's just a client for testing APIs. I shouldn't say just, it's a pretty sophisticated tool, but yeah, this is my favorite tool for testing APIs, so check it out if you want. And yeah, let's get into it. So let's get this out of the way. Okay, so this is what the sort of main screen looks like on my system. I think I probably changed the theme at some point, so it might look different on yours. But what you want to do is come here and click Create New Request. And you can call this whatever you want. So let's say Upload to S3. And the request type is going to be Post. And then the body of the request is going to be a binary file. So click Create, and it stubs this out for us. And what we want to do is put our URL up here. Maybe I can make this a bit bigger. And then we're going to choose a file here. So we come back to API Gateway and grab our URL. Here's our URL here. So we copy this, and then we can paste it here. And get rid of this again. And you can see this is our base URL, as I mentioned before. So you've got your API name, and then the region, and then the stage. Dev is our stage. And then on the end here, remember we have bucket and then file name. And so we can make this dynamic in our app, but for now we're just going to hard code it to make it a little bit simpler. So here we'll say, I believe the bucket was bubble upload test, or bubble upload demo. And then our file name will just say test, let's just say file123.png. And I'll bring the browser back for a second actually. So if we come back into our bucket, we can see here, there are no objects in here right now. And so what we'll do is we'll pick a file. So yeah, we come back into our bucket. We just close these sidebars here to give ourselves some more room. And yeah, so there's no objects in here. So what we're going to do is pick a file. So what we're going to do is pick a file. So what we're going to do is pick a file, and we'll pick cat1 here, and it'll ask us to set the content type header to image/JPEG, which is good. That's what we defined in as one of our binary types here in settings under API Gateway, right here. And so then we should be able to click send, and this, if we've set everything up right, and this 200 OK usually means that we have, then that cat photo should now show up in our bucket, and there it is. So as I said, we just called it file123.png, so this we'll make this a variable in the app, but if we open this up now, we can see there's our cat photo. So our backend integration with API Gateway is working, so that's all good. So then the next step is to move on to programming our Bubble app to be able to interact with this API. So let's do that now. Okay, so to create the uploader, there are a couple of steps. We're going to create an input for files, just using this reference code from Mozilla, and then we're going to modify it to change the appearance a little bit, and then we're going to create some JavaScript that reads the files that have been attached to this file uploader, and then sends it off to our API. So we can just grab this code here and come over to Bubble. That's our original one. And so to add custom HTML in Bubble, you look for the HTML element. We'll just draw it on the page here. It doesn't need to be this big, of course, but and then we paste in that code that we just grabbed from Mozilla, and you can see it shows up just like it does here. Choose a profile picture, etc. So we're going to change this. Let's say the label for, let's call the field uploader, and then we'll say choose a file to upload, and the input type will be file. The ID will change to uploader, so this label 4 and ID have to match. And then the name, same thing. And then let's just, for now, accept PNG and JPEG files. So it'll be a picture uploader. And in this one, I added some styling with some padding around it and changed the background color and stuff like that. So I'm not going to spend too much time on styling, but what you could do is something like this. You could wrap these two elements in a div. So a div is just an empty, meaningless container. And then you could say, in here, you could say style equals, and then say background color, cornflower blue, something like that. And you might want to adjust the height, maybe say height 100%. I don't know if this will work. Let's do pixels. Let's do 200 pixels. And then we've got a bigger div. And then you might want to style the input element a bit as well. So this div it's not all an input element. So you might in here do the same thing. You might say style equals, and then height, say 45 pixels. And then also you could say cursor pointer. So this will turn the mouse into a hand, the pointer into a hand when you hover over it. So we'll see what that looks like right now. Yeah, and so you can see all this isn't covered actually. So what we could do is increase the width as well. But you can see when we hover over it, we can click on it, and now we have a file uploader. And so yeah, maybe we'll just say in here height 100%, or sorry, width 100%, and then leave the rest of the styling as an exercise to the reader, as it were. Let's see if this modified it. Yeah, and so now over here we can click here as well if you want a huge button. Okay, so now we have a file uploader that will allow us to pick a file. You can see cat3 is now sort of nested in this object. So the question is, how do we get access to this object? So the way that we're going to do it is by using the Toolbox plugin, but before we do that, we can just sort of do this manually by opening up the developer console. So this allows us to type one-off commands and sort of figure out our logic and our functions before we put it into a file or sort of make it more stable. So it's good to experiment and test things. So the first thing we want to do is get a reference to this object and the file inside of it. So let's pick cat1. And so we know that this object here is called, the ID for it is uploader. So what we can do here is, to get a reference to this, we can use a document selector. So document in JavaScript just refers to the whole page. And then we want to say get element by, and then you have these different options, by class name, by ID, and so forth. We know the ID, so we're going to use that. IDs are unique in JavaScript, so they're usually good to select objects this way. And we know it's called uploader. So this will return this object. You can see it comes back here, but we want to stick this into a variable. So there are different ways you can do that. In JavaScript, you have these three keywords: const, let, and var. Let is an older, is used less now. It was in older JavaScript. It was for all variables. You would define them with let. These days, you typically use const or var. Const is for variables that don't change their value, and var is for variables that do. So we know that this is always going to be this, so we can just say const uploader equals, and then we can get this code here. So let's do that. So let's say const uploader equals whatever comes back from this, which is that uploader. And now if we type it, we can see we have that input. And what we want to do is get a reference to its files. So if we say uploader.files, then we get a file list of length 1. And so to get the first one, we say square bracket 0, and that returns this file. And so what we could say is const file equals uploader.files0. Now, I guess users might change it, so you might want to say var for variable file equals uploader.files. And now we've got this file object. And so now what we want to do is pass this to our API. So the way that we're going to do that is by using the fetch API, which you can see some documentation at this page here. There are various different ways to make requests to other endpoints or other sites or other resources in JavaScript. Fetch is quickly becoming the standard. It's really quite robust and easy to use compared to some things like XML HTTP request, which is an older one. So yeah, we're going to use fetch. And the way that we're going to do that is we could write out a function in here. So we could say const upload function equals fetch, and then we would pass the data, the URL, and the options here. This is what our request is going to look like. But as I mentioned, we're going to use snippets instead, because snippets are a really handy tool if you're building sort of more complicated logic. So if this was smaller, you would see this by default. It wouldn't be hidden. We've got this sources tab. And in this, you can create snippets. So a snippet is like a file that your browser will save, and it allows you to write multi-line functions that you can run again and again. So what I could say is I could say console.log test, and maybe take this again, just for the sake of illustration, and I can run it, and then down here, I can see test1 and test2. I'm going to clear this out for a second. But this is nice because I can run it again and again and again, and you don't have to keep going up and down through your command history this way. So it's a handy tool. So what we're going to do, first of all, is we're going to grab that function, the stuff that we typed here. So our reference to the uploader, we'll stick that in the snippet, like so. Let's expand this a bit so we have more room to work with. And then we'll say const, or no, we were going to say var file equals uploader.files0. So that gives us a reference to our file. So now what we should be so yeah, we've got this file object now, which has the name of the file, the size, and some other information. That's good. So now we have access to our file. So then the next thing we want to do is start building out our fetch call. So we can do that by saying, let's say upload function, say upload fn equals fetch. And then the fetch API takes two arguments. It takes a URL and an options object. So the options object has three things in it. So it has a method, which in our case is post. It has headers, which define the type of content that you're passing, and some other things. And then it has the body of the request. And so in this case, that's our file. Yeah, and the only headers that we need to pass for this are content type and accept. So content type is what we're passing to the API, and then accept is what we expect to get back. So you could do this in one of two ways. You could put curly braces inside this here and then define your options here. So we'll do that first. We could say method is post, and then headers, it's another object, and you could say content type is going to be image/PNG or JPEG, I guess in this case. We can make this dynamic in a minute. but we'll just hard code it for now. And then we'll say accept. And what we expect to get back from API Gateway is JSON. So we say application/JSON. Then we put a comma after the curly brace, and then our body will be file, which is this thing here. This should be enough to send our data off to our bucket. So we could test it right now actually and see if this works. Our URL is not defined. So our URL is going to be our API URL. So we could say, come back to API Gateway, come to Stages, and click on Dev, which is where we deployed it, the stage that we deployed our API to, and copy this and paste it here in double quotes. And so now we need this base URL as well as the bucket name, which is bubble upload demo. And then we need the file name. And so here let's do, let's just say bubblefile.jpg for now. And then we'll make this dynamic in just a second as well. Let's get this out of the way. And so we did miss something here. So when we try to run this, we get this CORS error, which I mentioned before. So these tend to pop up all the time. So it says no access control, no access control allow origin header is present. You see this all the time. This is the most standard CORS error, I think. And so the way to fix this is to come back to your API Gateway. And you can look at your requests and figure out, I have to go to resources first. You can try to figure out where it's coming from and manually add it. So for example, in here, in our method response, here, we should see a response header that says application, access control allow origin. So you could manually add that in here, and that might fix the issue. Or you can click actions here and click enable CORS, and this will do it for you. So this is usually a bit easier. So you click default here, make sure these are checked, and then this is the header it's going to allow, it's going to add. And then if we click this, it'll show us it's going to do a bunch of these things, like add these to the options method, add these headers to the post method down here. So click yes, it'll go through and do a bunch of things. And then after this, you want to redeploy your API. And it might take a minute for this to take effect, even though it shows that your API is now live. Sometimes these take a minute to update. So let's test it again, and if it doesn't work right away, I'll come back in a second. Yeah, so it's not working yet, so I'll come back in a minute and it should be updated. Okay, so it's 2 or 3 minutes later now, and if we run this again, we'll see that it's running successfully. So I can run this with Control-Enter, come back to S3, and then we see bubblefile.jpg. So this is probably helpful as an instructive error. These can be really tricky to debug, these CORS issues, because there are lots of different moving parts and you don't have complete control over the integration, although you can get pretty fine-grained control by going through some of these components here. The key thing is that in method response, you have this access control allow origin, that you have these options methods here. And then really critical is that you wait a couple of minutes after you change things, because this doesn't always update right away. And so it can be really deceptive to make a change, test it, it doesn't work, and then you're going to try something different. So when you do update your CORS settings, just give it a couple minutes before you try something else. Okay, so now this is sort of the base of what we need. This is basically it. So now what we're going to do is add a little bit of dynamism and variabilize some of our values. So we're going to change this from being hard-coded to being the name of the file that we've chosen. And we're going to change the extension to be coming from, so this content type here is going to come from the file as well. And then we're going to wrap this into a function, and then we're going to move it over into Bubble. So the first thing we might want to do is get the file name. So we could do that in a couple ways. We could pull that out. So let's say down here, we should have file, in our context. No, we don't have a file right now, so let's put a file in there. And then let's do this, const uploader, run this, just to, as I said, like this is a great way to iterate quickly. So let's say, var file equals uploader.file0. And so now we should have a file. Good. Now we have some properties on the file that we can use to send to our API. So we could say file.name, and that's how we can get our file name, so cat1.jpg, or we can say file.type, and that's how we'll get our extension. So we want to replace some of our values with these, right? So in here, we could replace this bubble file.jpg in a couple different ways. I'm going to shrink this a little bit. One way is we could just delete this and then say plus file.name, and this will work. Or you could store file name here by saying file.name and then say file name if you want to have this access to this elsewhere. And then a third option that you have is you could do what's called string interpolation. So you could replace your double quotes with backticks, and then inside, if you do $sign and then curly braces, you can type a variable here like file.name, and that'll replace it with the value. So if we do this, for example, and run it, it should show us in S3 that we now have cat1.jpg. So whatever you prefer, it's sometimes helpful to extract these variables rather than interpolate them inline if you're going to be using them in multiple places, but we're just using it here, so we don't need to do that. And backticks gives you a single line, so it's nice. Okay, so that's one thing you can do. And then the other thing is in our content type, we want to replace this with file.type. So you could say file.type. Okay, and so that's basically what we need to do to get the files to S3. And so now the next step is to take this code and move it into Bubble so that we can communicate between this JavaScript to Bubble and vice versa. So let's reload our page here. So the way that we can do that initially is we can just copy this code and paste it into one of those run JavaScript blocks. So let's put a button on our page here. I've already added that, but let's add a button and say upload chosen file, and then create a workflow to run some JavaScript. And we'll paste in our JavaScript from before. You can see here, you have less room to work with. You don't have highlighting, and it's just a little bit less pleasant to work in here than to work over here in this console. But yeah, that's fine. So you can bring up the rich text editor, which helps a little bit. But be mindful that if you do this and you have dynamic variables from Bubble, like you're grabbing a user ID or something, it can get mixed up here. So anyway, keep that in mind. So what we want to do is we could just run this function like this. We'd say uploader is this, URL is this, and then run this function. So we could try this and see if it works as is. Now we can pick, say, Billy Frog and click upload chosen file. And if we come back to S3 and our bucket, we should see Billy Frog in there. And there he is. And so we can open that, just make sure that it's transferring correctly, and there it is. So that's fine, but this doesn't give us quite as much control as we would like for a couple of things. So for example, we might want to let the user know that their file was uploaded. So what we can do is we can push data out of this function back into Bubble and show them an alert. So this is a handy thing to know, is how to connect these JavaScript snippets back into your Bubble app. So what we're going to do is come back to our page. We're going to say, put a JavaScript to Bubble element on the page. And this is just an invisible element. You can make it tiny and hide it. But what this allows you to do is it creates a function for you. So let's say we call it my function. Actually, let's call it uploaded to S3. And so now what it's going to do is you'll be able to call in your JavaScript code something called bubble_fn_uploaded to S3. And you pass it a variable, and that variable then becomes available as a Bubble variable. So I'll show you what that means in just a second. We want to trigger an event because what we're going to say is once over here, once we've finished uploading our file, we want to actually notify the user. So we're going to call this function, and we're going to trigger an event that we're going to be able to use to trigger an alert. We want to publish a value, which is how we get this value out. And the value type will be text. It'll be the name of the file. And then we can leave the other ones alone. So what we're going to do is under here, we want to say, we're going to have to change this code in just a second, but what we're going to say is bubble_fn_uploaded to S3. So it's going to fire this command, this function, and we could store its result in a variable if you wanted, something like this, const var, that's not right. Const response equals this, for example, but you don't need to do that. What we'll do instead here is we'll say file.name. A couple of minor modifications to the code. I'm just pulling this uploaded to S3 function out of this fetch function. And this should actually be called something a little bit more correct. It's not actually a function we're defining here. This is just a response. So we could say response or fetch response or something. Because what this is going to be equal to is the value that's returned from this fetch call. So it's a bit misleading to call it upload.fn. So let's just call it resp. And just in the interest of clarity. So now when we run this, we should get our file uploaded, and then we trigger this bubble function uploaded to S3, and we pass out our file name that we can use elsewhere. So what we're going to do is set up an alert to show on the screen to show the file name to the user. So we can come over to design. And I've added an alert here, but I'll just do this from scratch. So if we type alert and put this on the page, and we want to position it at the top, and then we can say your file, give it the name, has been uploaded. And then we can put in here, we can use a dynamic variable, which is JavaScript to bubble A's value. So now it should say your file, whatever, has been uploaded. Has been uploaded to S3. So let's see if this works. Oh no, we need to display this. So after this runs, what we want to do is say that when this event triggers, so remember that in the definition of this object here, we said trigger an event. So we can access that event in here by coming here and say when a JavaScript to bubble event happens. So it's this one. And when it happens, we want to display the alert, show message in an alert, I should say. And yeah, that should be enough. So let's see if this works. It should now, this might get in the way, but that's okay. I'm clicking the button with no file. So let's pick KitKat. We'll click upload, and it says your file KitKat has been uploaded to S3. And we come over here, and we can see now KitKat is there. So that's good. So now we are able to get data out of our JavaScript and get data into our S3 bucket. So that's basically it for uploading. One thing to note is sending the message that their file has been uploaded in this way. This doesn't actually depend on the response here. It's just firing regardless. So you could rewrite this to listen to the response that's coming back, and only if it's an okay response, then do this. That's one way you could do it. But I'm going to leave that as an exercise in the interest of time. Look into the await keyword if you're trying to do this so that you sort of wait for the response of this to come back. But asynchronous JavaScript programming is a little bit outside of the scope here. Make sure that this box is checked. This is important. But yeah, otherwise, this works fine for our purposes here. Okay, so one last thing you might want to do is add some dynamic data to your file names. So you could add user IDs or object IDs from the database or whatever. So what we're going to do is a combination of both. We'll add a user ID and a file ID to our file name. The reason you'd want to do this is because over here in S3 you can see we have cat1.jpg. If you have more than one person upload a file called cat1.jpg, the newer one's going to overwrite the older one. You don't want that. So what you can do is use your user's ID and an object ID from the database to specify your file name. So the way that we could do that is we could say create a new thing, and then we'll move this to the first step of the workflow in just a second. We've created this upload type in the database, and all it has is a name field, which we're going to leave blank initially, and then we'll set after the upload is done. So we'll say create a new upload object, and that'll create something with a unique ID. Whoops. And we'll do this before we run our JavaScript. And then in our JavaScript, we could say we want the ID of that object. So we could say var upload ID equals, and then we're going to use this dynamic data to pull data out of bubble. We're going to wrap it in double quotes, end it with a semicolon. And so in between the double quotes, we're going to say insert the result of step 1's unique ID. And so then what we could do is we could say, instead of in our URL passing our file name parameter just from the uploader, so file.name just comes from the uploader, we could say file name here. We could say const file name, or var file name, doesn't matter, equals file.name. And to the beginning of that, we want to append upload ID. So we could say upload ID plus, and then we'll add a little dash, and then add file name onto the end. So let's see if this works. And if so, then we should see a long string of digits, a dash, and then the name of the original file. So let's try that now. So we've got cat1 here, so we'll pick cat1 again and click, whoops, canceled that. Click upload chosen file. And now if we come back to S3, we should see, oh, and I forgot to change this in the in here in the URL. So now we want to delete this dot so that we're referencing file name instead of file.name. Yeah, you might want to use slightly more clear variable names. So here, let's pick cat1. Whoops. Let's pick cat1 again. Click upload. And now if we come back to S3, we should see this. So this here is the unique ID of that database object. So 16470, et cetera, et cetera. If we come into our database, come to our app data and look at this first upload that we created that has no name. Oh, there's a bunch of test ones here, but this, let's see. Yeah, this is the most recent one. So you can see that this string matches the same string over here in S3. Now you could also add your user's ID if you want, but I think actually I'll skip that. It's the exact same principle though. You would just put it in double quotes and then pull it out with dynamic data drop down from Bubble. And so then the final thing you might want to do with this new upload object is you might want to set the data, maybe set the file name of this object based on whatever was in this file uploader. So we could do that by coordinating two of these JavaScript to Bubble elements. So we could set one to be the file name, which is what we're doing here, and we could set another one to be the unique ID of this object. And then that will allow us to get that object from the database in a search, and then we'll just use the value in this one to set the name. So what we'll do is we'll send the file name to this value, and then we're going to send the ID of the object that we created here in a separate function. So if we copy this, we haven't created this element yet, so it won't do anything, but we could say, let's say update upload. Let's just say update upload in DB, and what we'll pass is the ID of this object we created in step 1. So we'll say result of step 1's unique ID. So now we want to create this function by creating one of these elements. So this is this is the first one we created. So we'll copy this, we'll call it B, say update in DB, and the suffix we'll give it is, let's delete this. What do we call it in our workflow? We want to call it update upload in DB. So we'll say update upload in DB. We'll trigger an event, publish a value, and it will be of type text. And so then we'll come in here, we can copy this, and we can say when JavaScript to Bubble B fires, then what we want to do, delete this, we want to make changes to a thing. We want to change we want to do a search for an upload, and its unique ID will be this JavaScript value. And so that's the object that we're going to get back. And then what we want to change, the first item that matches that, so it's unique, so it should be just one item that matches that. We want to set its name equal to JavaScript to Bubble A's value. And what you might want to do after this is clear these values. You might want to say, you might want to run some JavaScript and publish empty values for these two things, just so you don't get mixed up. But oh, and I missed, yeah, we need to put the value that's in here in strings, or sorry, in double quotes. Otherwise, JavaScript will get confused. So let's try this again. Okay, so now let's test that this is working. I've cleared out the database, so there's no uploads from before, and I've cleared out the S3 bucket. So let's upload cat1. Click upload chosen file. It says it's been uploaded. We can check here, and we see we have 1647300 on the end. And if we come here, we see cat1, and it should have the same unique ID with 300 on the end. Okay, so that's how you can connect different workflows and connect your JavaScript to your database and so forth. And so now we've got all the uploading done. So the last thing we want to do is be able to display this data to the user. And we're going to do that by creating a new API gateway endpoint to just pull the data in. And we're going to do that through our API connector. So let's do that now. So the first thing we'll want to do is come back to API gateway. We're still in our API here. And what we want to do is add a get method on this file name path. So it's going to be almost identical to the post method. But it will allow us to retrieve objects instead of put them. So we want to say AWS service again, region, same as before, service, same as before, simple storage service, subdomain empty, and then the HTTP method we want to use is get. We're going to use the same path override, so bucket / key. And then we're going to want to use the same execution role, paste that in here. And then content handling is passed through again. We click save. And I think this should be all we need to do on the API gateway side. Or sorry, there's the integration request. We have to do the same path parameter substitution as before. So bucket and key. So we'll add these. These are identical to the parameter substitutions in the put or post method. And file name. Okay, and that should be everything. So we should now be able to say deploy API. And if we've set this up correctly, we should be able to use the get endpoint to pull down a file. So let's grab this. And then on the bubble side, we're going to create an API connector connection to talk to this API. So come back to our bubble app. And we go into plugins, shrink this a little bit. We want to add, so we click the API connector. Click add an API. We're going to say, let's say custom S3 connection will be the name of our API. And then we're going to create a method, let's say get file for now, or get object, I guess. And we'll leave it as a get method. Here is our domain, our URL rather. And here on the end, we can hard code this or make it dynamic. I'm just going to hard code it for here. So we'll say upload bubble demo. And then we need the file name to be dynamic. So we'll say file name in here. And so the value will be whatever the name of the file is. So this is another reason you need to have this stored in your database as in the previous step. So you don't want this to be private. You want it to uncheck that so you can make it dynamic when you call this API. For the test, we'll grab the name of this file here to initialize the API. So we'll paste that in there. And once we set the file name, we change the data type to file. We don't need any headers or parameters. And if we initialize the API call, we'll get a preview here. And this should be our cat. So there it is. So that's all you need to do to get the files out. Okay, so then to display the data on the page, we're going to put a repeating group. And so what we'll do here is add the data type of upload. And so we just want to, for now, we'll just fetch all of the uploads. So we'll say do a search for upload and just return everything. And so that'll pull them all out of the database. And then we want to put an image for each one. And we want to display the image as, we're going to pull it from our API. So we'll say the dynamic, insert dynamic data, and we'll say get data from an external API, and the one that we just created. And then we need to specify the file name. Now, the way that we're storing the file name doesn't quite match to the way that we're storing it on S3. So we could correct this in a couple different ways. So this is the unique ID of the object. And then we have the actual name of the file that they uploaded on the end. So we could either store this whole thing in the database and rewrite the JavaScript a little bit to pass both of these in. That would work. Or we can compose it here. So we could say, let's do that. That's a bit easier for our purposes here. So let's say the file name is the current cells uploads unique ID. And then we want to append a dash like we have on S3. And then we want to append this current cells uploads name. So this should take the ID and then a dash and then the name, and this should load the picture from S3. Let's close that. Let's reload. And it should load here in a sec. So there's our cat. And so now let's try cat2. We should upload that. It should appear in a second here. Perfect. And then we'll do one more. And you can see as we upload, they appear. And so that's it. That's how you can upload data, download data, and use your own S3 bucket with your with your bubble apps. So there's lots of ways to get stuck here. So if you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. I try to answer all the questions that come through. So good luck and have fun.